This is my day one update on the process of producing and commercially releasing my debut single over the next 2 weeks. Day one wasn't particularly exciting. It was mostly a lot of prep work. The biggest thing I was preparing was a pretty robust Logic template for me to work from. I like to take a kind of non-traditional approach to most of my mixes, and it's certainly not the most efficient or simplest way to do things, but I find it works for me most of the time. But I'm a firm believer in the idea that there's no one right way to do things. As long as you can actually understand the impact that your choices are having on your mix, you should feel free to experiment with different ways to achieve the sound you're going for with the workflow that works for you. In my case, my mixes tend to be fairly impressionistic in a sense. I incorporate a lot of small elements that sort of add up to a huge wall of sound. So since there are so many different elements, I usually like to set up a bunch of submix layers to help keep things from being too chaotic. It also lets me apply multiple layers of processing so I can kind of glue my elements together and keep a sense of cohesiveness among them all. The problem is this ends up resulting in some pretty complex routing. Usually I'll just kind of figure it out as I go, but by the time I get to the final mix, I've added so many layers and buses that I start to lose track of what's being sent to where. And really, I'm using a lot of similar elements across most of my projects. So I made this template to essentially cover whatever I might want to do. I'm sure I won't use every one of these elements in this first song, but I'll probably use a bunch of them. And having it all set up from the start, instead of having to route a bunch of stuff each time I want to add a new element, should help me to not lose creative momentum while I'm working. So I guess let's take a look at the template I came up with before I start rambling too much. Like I said, I'm using a lot of different submix layers, so I set up a bunch of track stack folders to help keep it all organized. Just makes it look all neat and clean. This is already cleaner and neater than any Logic project I've ever made before, so that's a win. You can see we've got all our instrument groups here, and within these groups are smaller groups which contain our individual tracks. Now, a lot of these buses and tracks have a few plugins set up on them because there are a lot of plugins that I tend to almost always use on certain things. I'll definitely end up tweaking them for each project, but having them on the tracks in my template gives me a good starting point most of the time. The best example of all of this is probably our drums and percussion bus, so let's take a look at that. I like to blend my drum kit with other percussive elements, and then I like to process them all together at the end with a little bit of glue. So I've broken this main drums and percussion bus down further into my drum kit, electronic drums, and orchestral and other percussion. This lets me give a little bit of glue to each group of instruments and then a bit more at the end to keep all the percussive elements feeling nice and cohesive. Inside my drum kit folder, I've got Superior Drummer loaded, and you can see all the individual mics are feeding into this drum kit bus. Most of the other tracks I've built out don't have any instruments loaded or anything, but I spent a while putting this kit together with the general drum sound I tend to go for, so I figured it was a good thing to include on the template instead of trying to recreate that sound every time I start a new project. So we've got all our drum tracks, and they've all got a little bit of general processing on them, as well as a bunch of sends to other buses for parallel processing. Now, with all these submix layers, I can start to experience issues when it comes to balancing everything if I'm not careful about what I've routed where. For example, if I'm routing individual drum tracks to a reverb and then I go to adjust the volume of the whole drum bus, it won't change the volume of the drum's reverb send. So if I spend a whole bunch of time getting the right mix of reverb on my drums, that just ends up getting thrown out the window as soon as I adjust the overall level of the drum bus. So I've been very careful to avoid routing too many tracks to my global reverb unless it's closer to the top of the chain. So like my drum kit drums are mostly going to their own reverbs here, which then feed into the main percussion bus. So when I get to the final mix and I'm adjusting the volume balance of all my percussive elements, I'm not also affecting the reverb balance of those elements. It's not perfect, and I'm still routing some elements to my global reverb, but this at least kind of minimizes the impact that small level adjustments have on the overall reverb balance. Anyway, I've got some other parallel processing elements, like this kick punch track that emphasizes my kick's transients, so I can bring that up if I feel like my kick is lacking some punch. Same thing with the snare. I've got a track that's heavily compressed and emphasizes the main body frequencies of the snare, and I can bring that in if I feel like my snare is a bit thin. And then this width track that I can bring in to add some extra stereo width to my drum kit. And then one of the most important things I've got set up, in my opinion, is these sidechain tracks. I'm routing my main drum elements, the kick, snare, and toms, to their own individual sidechain tracks. Now, these tracks have no output set, so you're never actually hearing them. They're only there to trigger dynamic EQs on my other buses, so I can carve out conflicting frequencies that are masking and stepping all over the drums. This allows me to have harmonically dense mixes while still maintaining some punch in my drums. And the fact that I'm only cutting the specific conflicting frequencies helps keep this as transparent as possible. So I don't have to worry too much about this side-chaining process causing unwanted pumping. So for example, I have these side-chained dynamic EQs on my main guitar bus, and each one is being triggered by a different drum track to slightly cut those conflicting frequencies whenever that drum hits. And all my other submixes are essentially set up the same way. For my basses, I have one bus for my bass guitar layers and one for my synth bass layers. And then they each get a little bit of glue on each of those buses, and then a little bit more at the end on the final bass bus. And then I've also got this bass saturation track that I can bring in if I want a bit more saturation on my basses to really bring out those upper harmonics and kind of help the bass line remain intelligible if you're listening on speakers that don't have much low end. And that saturation track is also routed to the main bass bus so that its level will be adjusted with the basses as a whole, and I don't have to worry about rebalancing too many elements if I need to make volume adjustments. For my guitars, it's more context dependent, and I often have so many layers of guitar going that it becomes a bit muddy and I lose intelligibility if I'm doing too much bus mixing on them. But I've still set aside a bunch of buses for guitars so that I can glue together any layers that need it while still sending most of my parts directly to the main guitar bus. So for example, if I'm double tracking guitars or harmonizing tracks that I want to sound like one part, I'll compress those things together. But otherwise, I try to keep the bus processing, especially on the main guitar bus. I often have so many varying guitar elements that are all so different from each other, so processing them too much as a whole can cause them to become a bit homogeneous, and you lose intelligibility of the individual parts. And then I've got a bunch of effects tracks set up for my guitars, since I tend to like a lot of reverb and a lot of delay on my guitar tracks. I've played around with a bunch of different ways to record my guitars, from running through my ridiculously excessive pedal board setup to just using software amps, and I kind of settled on something kind of in the middle. I'll probably go much more in depth on this and why I settled on this approach when I actually get around to recording my guitar parts. But a quick overview is that I'm recording my guitar tracks DI, then doing some flex time editing and adding some light compression on the DI track to even out the dynamics and make up for my less than stellar technique. I can then add any preamp effects I might want to use, like overdrive or modulation, or sometimes preamp reverbs if I happen to be going for that shoegazy, super saturated reverb sound. And then I'm reamping these edited and affected DI tracks through my Hughes & Kettner Tubemeister behind me, using these effects buses to apply any final effects that would normally go in the effects loop of my amp, like reverbs and delays. I've also got a saturation bus for my guitars, similar to what I've got on the basses, for when I want to add some nice, gooey, saturated warmth to my guitars. The rest of the buses are all fairly straightforward and follow the same general approach, so I don't think I really need to go into them right now. I've already probably talked for way too long as it is, so let's try to wrap this up. I've got all of these buses, besides my main vocal bus routed to a final instrumental bus before going to the master stereo bus. This lets me do any broad volume adjustments I might need to make to balance the instrumental with the vocals in the final mix, and so I can make sure my master bus is always being fed a nice level. And then I've got my general mastering chain set up on my mastering bus. I try to avoid actually turning the mastering chain on until I'm mostly done the mix, since I don't want to be compensating too much for a bad overall mix with the processing on the master bus. But I do find it helpful to make those final adjustments with the mastering chain engaged, since it gives me a better idea of what the final product is going to sound like. And that's my template. That's what I spent most of my first day prepping. I do most of my composing using Guitar Pro, since that's basically what I learned to write music on. And despite learning how to use a bunch of other composing programs, Guitar Pro is still what feels most natural for me. So this template essentially allows me to export a MIDI file from Guitar Pro and just kind of drag and drop it right into Logic. And I have to just rearrange a couple of things, but it's pretty much ready to go right from the beginning, which is nice. I'll finish this video by giving you a quick look at the Guitar Pro tab for the song that I'll be working on. It's relatively basic compared to a lot of the stuff I've written, in the sense that it's only 4 guitar parts instead of my usual dozens, and I've only got a few main synth parts actually written out. Other than that, we've got our bass and drums, and that's it. So my next step was to import this to a MIDI file and drag this into my beautiful Logic template. I think I've already covered enough in this first video, so I'll save going into the actual project file for my next update. But I've done a quick little mix of what I imported, and I've put it in the background of this video. So the song you've been hearing under my incessant talking is a rough demo of the song I'll be working on. It's obviously still unmixed and very rough, but it gives a good idea of what my starting point is after making this template, and essentially just dragging the MIDI directly in. So join me again tomorrow to see the next steps. I promise it'll get more interesting and less technical as we go, especially now that I've gotten most of the dry technical stuff out of the way with this video. But I also love nerding out about engineering and mixing. So for all the other audio nerds out there, I wanted to go in depth on my general mixing approach and how it relates to this template that I made, since it's the kind of content I personally enjoy watching. Feel free to ask me any questions you might have in the comment section. I'm always happy to talk mixing. So with that, I'll bring this to a close. Subscribe to keep getting updates on my progress. Like this video to make me feel personally validated. And I'll see you back here in a day or two with more updates.